Here on My Life in Gaming, we've made no secret of our love for the growing trend of physical releases for games that would otherwise only be available for digital download. In an earlier episode, we took a look at some PS4 and Xbox One games that we were surprised to discover had been released as budget titles on disc for only $20. In this episode, we're going to take a look at several noteworthy games that are available only as digital downloads in North America, but received import-friendly physical releases in Europe and Asia.
There was a point in time where I flirted with the idea of going digital only for all of my games. Needless to say, it didn't take long before I realized that it just wasn't for me, and instead veered far in the other direction. I wanted every game in physical form, if possible. Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty for the PlayStation 3 was probably the first game that opened my eyes to the fact that other regions could sometimes get games on disc that might be download only here in the US. Insomniac Games developed Quest for Booty with a digital distribution model in mind, and as it was only available in this form in North America. But internationally, there was an option for a Blu-ray release at a budget price, so I imported the European version, which will play perfectly on a US console. The final version of the game is on the disc, meaning that no patches needed to be downloaded. Quest for Booty picks up right after the cliffhanger to Tools of Destruction. Ratchet finds himself stranded on the planet Murdergraw and pursued by the evil Captain Darkwater. Hoping to find some information on how to rescue his good pal Clank, who had been abducted by the enigmatic Zoni, Ratchet finds hope in the relic called the Fulcrum Star. Despite being in the game's title, Clank is almost entirely absent from the story here. Considering my general distaste for Clank's puzzle-oriented sequences in other games, I found this to be a pretty welcome reprieve.
This is it, Talon. Darkwater has to be here somewhere.
Be careful, Ratchet. Murdergraw's an unregulated planet. Unwanted visitors have a bad habit of disappearing from here.
Where Clank's absence is really felt is in the number of moves you have at your disposal. Gone are your long jumps, hovering, and more. The game works around this issue by placing a bit more emphasis on Ratchet's own equipment, such as his magnetic boots and swing shot. These add just enough variety in terms of gameplay and traversal that you never find yourself getting bored. Not to say that there's really going to be much time to get bored anyways. Quest for Booty's relatively breezy sub-3 hour runtime justifies the fun-sized moniker that adorns the packaging. Fans of the series will probably be able to blow through this adventure even quicker. However, just because it's billed as a mini-adventure doesn't mean that Insomniac skimped out on other aspects. Quest for Booty is a fantastic looking and sounding game with a tight gameplay that the series is known for. When a remake of Psygnosis' iconic Shadow of the Beast was announced for the PlayStation 4 back in 2013, I was immediately intrigued, and then, well, I totally forgot about it. By the time it was released in May of 2016, I had little to no real interest left. It wasn't until I saw that there was a disc version being released in Asia that was going to be completely in English. Because of that, I snapped it up day one. To this day, there has been no patch needed for this release. Before I get into this new version, I think it's important to state that I have very little experience with the original. I mostly knew of the game from screenshots of the Amiga original in magazines. Seeing that opening area, a sprawling field with parallax scrolling clouds in the distance, was one of the few times that I really wanted a PC as a kid. This new version opens with your character under the control of some sort of floating specter. Forced to kill humans, something awakens inside the beast and allows him to break free of his chains. Now sentient, he sets out to kill his captors. Shadow of the Beast is a side-scroller of the 2.5D variety, so it retains some familiarity for fans of the original, but the journey itself is much, much different. The locations that the Beast will pass through are suitably alien with lots of moody lighting going on. It really lives up to how I imagined the game to be in my mind as a child. Where things are really expanded upon is the combat. Instead of flowing naturally across the game, it's now sectioned off in a way that is reminiscent of a Platinum Games action title. Enemies approach you from the left and right, and you hack, slash, and throw them around to build your blood meter. Pulling L2 and R2 triggers Rage Mode, where you can mow down enemies on both sides in rapid succession. Afterwards, you're graded on performance. Speaking of blood meters, holy mackerel is this game gory. The Beast lusts for blood and it splatters across everything in this game. It restores his life and gives him supernatural abilities. This is messy in a good way. The Wisdom of Shadows menu allows you to power up the Beast's various attributes while also unlocking a number of bonus history features. Of note here is the original version of the game in all its 50Hz glory. You can also play the remake with the original's vastly superior musical score.
I had a pretty good time playing infamous Second Son when it released in the early months of the PS4's life, and it still stands out as a rather technically accomplished game. A standalone side story starring the character Fetch was released a short 5 months after the main game, called Infamous First Light.
Hey there, Fetch. Now, I put out my feelers, but these occurrences are on a hair trigger. We'll have to move fast on a lead.
Okay, I'm already headed for some neon gas.
You shouldn't think of First Light as DLC because it does not require Second Son to play, but unfortunately in North America, First Light is download only, but in European and Asian regions it did get its own physical Blu-ray release. I grabbed the Asian release, and any version plays in English if your PS4 system is set for English, with no meaningful differences from the American version as far as we know. Circle confirm on the Asian version aside. First Light is a prequel to Second Son. The story jumps between Fetch's time as a prisoner of the DUP and her life before then as a conduit on the run. Second Son's main antagonist Augustine plays a role, but the true villain of this story is a small-time Seattle drug lord who ruins Fetch's life in a way that's honestly infuriating to watch. Mundane as he may be, Shane stands out to me as one of the most genuinely jerkish jerks in video game villainy.
Oh my god.
Come here. No, I'm so sorry, darling, but I'm gonna need to put you on the payroll. At least till I get set up around town, then I promise you will get him back.
Fetch, don't!
Scout's honor.
Don't do this.
Fetch's conduit power is Neon, arguably the coolest set of powers in Second Son, and it's neat to see a game built around it. It doesn't introduce much of anything new to the formula, and unfortunately most of it takes place in the exact same Seattle as Second Son. So I can understand why it wasn't met with a ton of enthusiasm on release. It's just Second Son, but less of it. But for me, it had been a couple of years since I'd played Second Son, so it was actually a fun way to revisit the series. A short romp that tells a compelling story. An open world game that was over before I could get bored with it. Not such a bad thing after all. First Light does have some patches that are not on the disc. Notably, both First Light and Second Son were patched well after the fact for PS4 Pro and HDR support. Pro support allows for a higher resolution mode with a similar frame rate to the base PS4, or a performance mode which, according to Digital Foundry, mostly plays very close to 60 frames per second. I find the HDR modes in the Infamous games to be weirdly dark in the shadows, requiring an in-game brightness adjustment to compensate. But Fetch's neon powers are of course a perfect fit for HDR-capable screens. Square Enix opened a studio called Tokyo RPG Factory with a directive to develop classic-style Japanese RPGs for modern platforms. Their first game, I Am Setsuna, was highly anticipated by RPG fans, but ultimately released in 2016 to a generally lukewarm reception. Still, I wanted to judge it for myself. It was initially released in Japan for PS4, Vita, and Windows, but the Vita version never left Japan. Setsuna was released on a PS4 Blu-ray disc in Japan, but the initial releases in other territories were digital only. I Am Setsuna later saw a 2017 release as a Nintendo Switch launch title, but with an interesting twist. The physical version was still only released in Japan, but unlike the PS4 version, when the game card is inserted into an English language Switch, it automatically treats the game as the English version, even displaying the English version cover art on the Switch dashboard. I understand that French is also supported. Okay, so maybe this one doesn't technically follow the disc theme we've had up to now, but the Switch version is a great option for getting a physical copy that you can play in a language you might understand, thanks to Nintendo finally embracing region-free hardware. I Am Setsuna takes place in a world covered in snow. Don't expect to see much in the way of a change of scenery or a change in tone. The music is almost exclusively piano, but I rather like it. The silent protagonist is Indir, a masked mercenary who is hired to slay a girl named Setsuna, who he instead decides to spare and join her guard. Setsuna has been chosen as the next sacrifice, an accepted reality in this world, who must travel to the distant Last Lands and give up her life in a ritual that supposedly stems the tide against monsters growing in number and becoming more savage. I Am Setsuna has from the beginning been pegged as a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, copying its base gameplay liberally. Perhaps welcoming a comparison to one of the most revered RPGs of all time didn't work in Setsuna's favor, but I actually feel that it makes some smart advancements over its inspiration. The most interesting is the momentum system, where once the active time battle meter is full, a secondary meter begins to fill, which can store up to 3 momentum charges. This is pretty cool because it gives purpose to the time that a character may spend waiting for a command, or while you wait to team up for a combo attack, the most obvious takeaway from Chrono Trigger. Momentum charges are spent by hitting the Y button just before an attack, which adds additional damage or special effects to attacks, techs, and combos. In addition, an almost overwhelming number of tech and passive skill options are available to each character, allowing for a degree of customization not possible in Chrono Trigger.
できるの。はい。俺に敗北は許されない。
Some of the menu operations could certainly do with a good deal of streamlining, and it could stand to be more clear what abilities your party needs to have equipped to maximize combo potential. And by the later stages of the game, I did manage to devise a pretty broken setup that allowed normal encounters to be almost too easy, unleashing devastating momentum combos on the first turn that ultimately recovered my MP afterward. All the same, I found Setsuna to be a really compelling RPG that, while it may not surpass its inspiration in terms of story and character, is worth playing for its own merits. And it doesn't hurt that it only took me less than 20 hours to beat, which, you know, sometimes it's just nice to have a breezy RPG. The Switch version of I Am Setsuna is overall a really solid version to own. In docked mode, it runs in 1080p just like the PS4 version, although the frame rate is 30 instead of 60, which in my opinion is hardly an issue in a game like this. Plus, I absolutely took advantage of the Switch's portability while I was playing through the game. A free Switch-exclusive competitive DLC update was released in April 2017 to upgrade the software to version 1.1.0, but otherwise, I Am Setsuna for the Switch is content complete on the game card.
これで戦えるわ。力を合わせて決めるわ。
Capcom has been a fairly big proponent of physical releases in Japan, releasing some amazing games on disc there on both the PS3 and PS4 that have been digital only in other regions. I'm going to look at a number of them here. The reboot of Strider back in 2014 didn't exactly bring the series or character to new heights. But let's face it, most people these days know of the character from the Marvel vs. Capcom series anyways. Regardless, I think it's still a really fun game. The developer, Double Helix, did a great job mixing the gameplay of the two arcade games with a more Metroidvania style that was present in the NES game. The difference between the PS3 and 4 versions come down to the resolution and frame rate. The PS4 version runs at 1080p, 60 frames per second, and the PS3 version runs at 720p, 30 frames. So while I wish that this physical release was of the PS4 version, I'm just kinda happy that anything was released at all. Starter Hiryu infiltrates Kazakh City to bring down the mysterious dictator Grandmaster Mayo. He'll pick up additional moves and weapon enhancements along the way that let him access new areas deep inside the bowels of the city. Although I miss the extra resolution of the PS4 version, Strider isn't exactly a great-looking game anyways. It starts out rather dark and drab and never really gets better. The entire game has a sort of scanline filter over everything, which is an interesting choice, but it doesn't really do much in terms of clarity. Where it really excels, though, is the music. There's some absolutely fantastic remixes of themes from previous games, which draw equally from the arcade and NES game. I love the Devil May Cry series on the PlayStation 2. Well, specifically the first and third game. But I completely skipped over 4 when it was released on the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2008. Maybe it was because it took the focus off of Dante and brought in a newcomer, Nero. I usually dislike when series do that kind of thing. In 2015, Capcom released Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition on the PS4 and Xbox One, with the involvement of the original team and director. I was a bit apathetic at first, but once I heard it was going to be receiving a disc release in Japan, I figured it was probably time to give it a shot.
You got a jacked up notion of fair play, pal. And it's beginning to piss me off.
This release has a minor patch that is fairly vague in its description, but I can't imagine it being anything super important. Also, everything shows up in English if played on an English language system. Devil May Cry created the template for 3D action games, and it's been continually improved upon over time. The combo-based gameplay is fun, but I'm honestly not good enough to really show it off as it should be. There's plenty of high-level gameplay out there if you want to see it. This version supposedly rebalances certain aspects of the original version, which in itself makes it appealing for fans. But what else about this constitutes the special edition label? Sure, it moves at a smoother frame rate and is of a higher resolution than the original, but there is some really significant additional content here that makes it well worth purchasing if you've already played it. For starters, Dante's companions, Trish and Lady from DMC 1 and 3 are now fully playable. In addition, Dante's brother is also playable. Each of these characters have unique playstyles and offer plenty of nuances to explore and utilize. In all, this is absolutely the definitive console release of Devil May Cry 4. It even includes features from the PC version of the original, like Turbo Mode, which increases the overall game speed by 20%. Capcom's fantastic Dungeons & Dragons arcade games, Tower of Doom and Shadow over Mystara, were finally released on home consoles in North America in 2013. This digital download by Iron Galaxy stylistically fell in line with a number of Capcom's other releases at the time. These were a great way to finally play these games at home and in English, but for those of us who wanted to own these games on a disc, well, we were out of luck unless we shelled out for the increasingly more expensive Saturn versions. In Japan, however, a disc was released for the PS3 with these games on it. But there is a catch. These aren't the same versions that were released in the US. Instead, Capcom handled development internally with the same team that made the games in the first place. That's right, this is a different release than is on PSN. Unfortunately, the largest downfall to this version is the language barrier. There's no English option at all. In-game text is almost entirely in Japanese, and all the menus are as well. You will definitely need a translation guide for this. Despite this, I feel like it visually looks better than the Iron Galaxy version. Scaling has a lot more options, allowing you to get a nearly pixel-perfect look to everything. You can also soften the image if you don't like the hard edges. Capcom's D&D games are at their heart brawlers with a number of RPG-style flourishes. In each game, you choose a character and set out on your journey. Each class of character has different attributes, strengths and weaknesses. Some are magic users, others not. After each level, you can choose from multiple paths that send you to different story beats, so between the two games there's quite a bit of replayability, if you don't mind the regional issues. There's also a few additional titles that I haven't covered here. Capcom released a physical edition of their PS3 versions of Resident Evil 4 and Code Veronica. And before that, the Okami HD PS3 disc was exclusively released in Asian regions. But later they announced a new version which is slated for physical release. Slain, Back from Hell is a digital download game that was released on a physical disc for the PlayStation 4 by the UK-based Signature Edition Games. It includes a number of bonus items such as a art book and CD soundtrack that make it worth your while. If I had to sum up Slain, I describe it as Castlevania plus Rastan meets Super Meat Boy with a heavy metal aesthetic. You play as Bathoran, a warrior returned to life to free the land from a group of ghoulish overlords. You slice, dice, and platform through a fantastically drawn pixel art world filled with mythical beasts and bloody, gruesome deaths. Throughout his journey, Bathoran will acquire a number of different weapons like axes and flaming swords with which to bludgeon his enemies. These look really cool, but it's hard to say if either offers any real advantage over the other. I feel like Slain looks more like an older PC game than anything you would have seen on a console. The gothic look is really well done, with gore and grime seeping from every orifice. Animation on the backgrounds, character, and enemies is fluid. Admittedly, I'm not much of a metalhead, but I couldn't help but smile every time that Bathoran would headbang after he took down each overlord. Apparently, when Slain was first released, it was riddled with issues such as an unbalanced difficulty and overly loose controls. The developer went back to the drawing board and patched all these issues, resulting in a much better game overall. Thankfully, this release contains that patch on disc, so you'll have the best version of the game right out of the gate, and preserved for the future.
Umehara Kawase, originally for the Super Famicom but with ports and sequels on various platforms, may not look like much at a glance, at least not until you see it in action. The series is known for having difficult but rewarding play mechanics for those who are willing to put in the effort. Umehara Kawase is a girl with a fishing rod who gets around platforming stages by hooking to walls and swinging around with a rather unique sense of physics. It's very much unlike other swinging games like Bionic Commando and is much more physicsy than what you might expect to play on systems like Super Famicom or PlayStation. A third official game in the series, Sayonara Umehara Kawase, was released on 3DS in Japan in 2013 and later ported to PlayStation Vita and Windows in 2015, becoming the first game in the series to get released outside Japan, but only digitally. But since the Vita is region-free, importing the physical Vita release from Japan is a great way to get a taste of this quirky series, especially with the Super Famicom version included is a bonus, and is PlayStation TV compatible. There's not a huge language barrier to get past the menus and into the action, though you might get a bit confused by some of the help text in the first few levels. Not to worry though, your actions are pretty basic, it's the execution that gets rather tricky, and at times to hilarious consequences. You simply jump and throw your hook out in 8 directions. You can lengthen or shorten your line by holding up or down, which helps pull you up to ledges or readjust your swing. Hook enemies and reel them in to toss them into your backpack. The map has branching paths that lead to different final destinations, and trust me, it gets extremely difficult, and I'm nowhere close to seeing all of the levels. It's not a pretty game by any means, but it has a certain charm and certainly doesn't play like anything else that I can think of. The series has a bit of a cult status, and the Super Famicom cartridge is rather pricey, so the Vita version is a nice way to represent it in your collection. With the release of Final Fantasy II and V on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy III remained the last numbered entry in the series to have never seen release outside Japan, until a full-on 3D remake was released for the Nintendo DS in 2006. Final Fantasy III seems to get a bit of hate, or maybe it's just this version, I've never really been sure, but I personally really like it. The Final Fantasy III remake was later ported to numerous platforms, but perhaps most interesting is the PSP version, released only as a download outside Japan, which is also compatible with PlayStation Vita and now also works with PlayStation TV. It may not be as high-res as the Windows or smartphone versions, but the improved clarity and vastly superior sound quality makes it a nice upgrade over the DS version. So you might be interested to know that the Japanese UMD release for the PSP version will play in English when inserted into an English language PSP. This makes it the highest quality official English physical release that you can buy of Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III is a bit of a bare-bones RPG. It introduced the much-loved job system, but it isn't anywhere near as flexible or refined as Final Fantasy V's. All the same, I still enjoy a good straightforward JRPG, and the Final Fantasy III remake presents a nice level of challenge. Tough enough to make me feel like I'm about to die on most boss encounters, but tuned just right so that I rarely actually do. I recall doing a fair bit of grinding later on, but only because I really wanted to level up certain jobs. I also really like the art style, though I'm not sure if maybe that's one of the things people don't like. I've even got these little figures from the game. I personally love the look. Maybe we'll never get anything equivalent to an official English release of the Famicom original, but until then, I'm happy enough with this charming little remake.
If you're like us and prefer to play and own physical game discs or cards, then it's important to remember to watch out for what's being released in places beyond where you live. The games we featured in this episode are far from everything, and more are being released regularly. Thankfully, physical media for these sorts of smaller releases seem to be in the midst of a major comeback, and sometimes games that are released only in one region end up crossing the ocean months later. But sometimes they never do. And that's why region-free software is one of the best parts about modern gaming.